In this lecture, we're going to look at primarily two important amendment or laws which are being passed, namely the Environment Impact Assessment and National Rehabilitation and Resettlement Policy, which are framed with regards to the kind of issues which we have discussed so far, the issues of conservation induced displacement or development induced displacement, and so on and so forth. So we'll begin with looking at the evolution of how these environment impact assessments have been situated globally and in the context of India, and then move on to looking at the NRP, and more importantly, as we go along with the discussion, we're going to also look at some of the issues which revolve around the social impact assessment. Now, at least we all are in some form or the other being familiar with environment impact assessment, and which is something very much vital and important component as we as a nation go on, and then with the industrial growth and then certain others development happening around us. So environmental impact assessment can be defined as a study to predict the effect of a proposed activity or project on the environment. So it in some sense tries to evaluate the likely environmental impacts of proposed project or development programs, which are by taking into considerations the likely impact which it might have on the socio-economic, cultural and human health impacts, which are both in some sense beneficial and also adverse. So the UNEP give outline the definitions about the environmental impact assessment as a tool which is being used to identify the environment, the social as well as the economic impacts of a project prior to taking a decision. So in other sense, it also aims to predict the environmental impacts at an initial stage, that in early stage when a project is being framed and designed, and also find ways and means to reduce the adverse impacts, and accordingly the projects are being framed in order to suit the local environment, and also present the likely impact. So therefore it gives in some way a broader worldview on the part of the decision makers before actually initiating any kind of decision. So therefore environment impact assessment is a decision making tool, and it in some way provides some kind of an alternatives to those who are framing the project. So further, International Association of Impact Assessment, the IAIA, defines it as the process of identifying, predicting, evaluating and mitigating the biophysical, social and other relevant effects of development proposals prior to major decisions being taken and commitments made. So we'll come after a point to discuss some of these points, such as how the scoping and then assessing and mitigations are being carried out, which of course consists the main elements or gist of the EIA. So as we had already pointed out, EIA is intended to prevent or minimize the potentially adverse environmental impacts and also enhance the overall quality of the project. So EIA has actually become mandatory a procedure way back in the 1970s with the implementations of the National Environmental Policy Act NEPA way back in 1969 in the US. So in some sense the EIA have begun to evolve or in India in the late 70s. So the EIA, as we had already outlined and gave a brief overview of what is EIA. So EIA in some sense systematically examines both the beneficial and adverse consequence of the project and also ensure that these effects are taken to account during the project designs. So therefore it in some sense helps to identify the possible environmental effects of the proposed project. And if one has to look at discuss the various important stages which involve in the EIA, the first and foremost is the screening, that is to determine which projects or developments require a full or partial impact assessment study. So depending on the kind of projects which are going to be carried out and likely impact is going to cause depending on the adverseness of the project. The second is to conduct scoping. So scoping is to identify which potential impacts are relevant to assess based on the legislative requirements, the international conventions, expert knowledge and public involvements. So in some sense it attempts to identify alternative solutions that avoid, mitigate or compensate adverse impact on biodiversity, which include the option of not proceeding with the development and finding alternative designs or sites which avoid the impacts, and also incorporating safeguards in the design of the project or providing compensation for adverse impacts and to finally derive terms or reference for the impact assessment. So the third one is the impact analysis, that is assessment and evaluations of impacts and development of alternatives to sort of predict and identify the likely environmental impacts of a proposed project or development, including the detailed elaborations of alternatives. So the fourth process is again the mitigation. So this step of the environment impact assessment recommends the actions to reduce and avoid the potential adverse environmental consequence of the developmental activities. So the fifth stages is submitting a report, that is reporting the environmental impact assessment, impact statement or the EIA report, which include an environmental management plan and a non-technical summary for the general audience. And the next step involves review of the EIS, that is the environmental impact statement, based on the terms of reference, that is scoping and public, including the authority, that is the public participations. So in some sense it is the stakeholders which is the locals, have also been part of the decision makers. So decision making on whether to approve the project or not and under what conditions are some of the steps which is necessarily involved. And then often these are some of the issues which are usually being encountered when any kind of projects or development programs are being initiated and being carried out, because there are issues or reports of bypassing these steps. And the final stage is the monitoring, compliance, enforcement, and environmental auditing. So they sort of monitor whether the predicted impacts and proposed mitigation measures occur as defined in the EMP, and also verify the compliance of proponent with the EMP to ensure that unpredicted impacts or failed mitigation measures are being identified and addressed in a timely fashion. So these are some of the forms of impact assessment. And now if we are to sort of like locate how the evolution of this EIA actually takes place. So the pre-1970, that is the project review, are usually based on the technical or engineering and economic analysis, and therefore a limited consideration is given to the environmental consequences. And the late 1970s and early 1980s have sort of come up with a more formalized guidance, and the use of this EIA by some of the developing countries, and greater emphasis on the ecological modeling, predictions and evaluations methods are being carried out. So the very likely forms of impact assessment, as I had already pointed out, is based on the strategic environment assessment, and which usually takes place at early stage of the decision making cycle, and also a proactive approach to development proposals. So these are some of the likely strategic environment assessment which takes place, and also the way in which how this broader perspective of the way in which things are being initiated. So one can also see that if you want to compare between the environment impact assessment and the strategic environment assessment, one could actually see that, for instance, in environment impact assessment, it talks about the limited number of feasible alternatives, but whereas in strategic environment assessment, it talks about considering a broad range of potential alternatives. And in the EIA, decision making takes place at the end of a decision cycle, but in a strategic environment assessment, it takes place at earlier stages of decision making cycle. So one can actually see the way in which the differences between the EIA and the strategic environment assessment. So before delving into the stakeholders in the EIA process, one can sort of like familiarize ourselves with the way in which how the EIA has evolved in India, and trying to situate the history of EIA in India, that is the Indian experience with environmental impact assessment began in the past few decades, that is in the late 1970s, when the Planning Commission asked the Department of Science and Technology to examine the river valley projects from an environmental angle. So this was subsequently extended to cover those projects which require the approval of the Public Investment Board. So till the period 1994, environmental clearance from the central government was an administrative decision and like enhance it like legislative support. So in way back in 1994, in the month of January, the Union Ministry of Environment and Forest, the MOEF, Government of India, under the Environmental Protection Act, promulgated an EIA notification making environmental clearance mandatory for expansion of or modernizations of any activity, or for setting up new project listed in the Schedule 1 of the notification. Since then, there have been 12 amendments made in the EIA notifications in the year 1994. So recently in 2006, the MOEF notified the EIA legislation, and the notification makes it mandatory for various projects such as mining, thermal power plants, river valley, infrastructure, that is roads, highways, ports, harbors and airports, and industries including very small electroplating or foundry units to get environment clearance. So however, unlike the EIA notifications of 1994, the new legislations has actually put the onus of clearing projects of the state government depending on the size, capacity of the project. So we have discussed the EIA process, and we then come to the likely stakeholders in the EIA process. So the first stakeholders are those who propose the project. So it could be the corporates, it could be any agency which sort of like propose the project. So the environmental consultant who prepare the EIA on behalf of the project proponent are the second who are involved in this EIA, and also the pollution control board, including both the state and the center. So the public has also the right to express their opinion or raise issues concerning them, because they are also partly, one of the main important stakeholders. The Impact Assessment Agency and also the regional center of the MOEFCC. So this is how the environment impact assessment, what are the likely process normally which have to undergo, and the stakeholders which are involved. And since the late 1970s, India has also been strictly following the EIA. So the Ministry of Environment and Forest is the supreme or the authority in terms of issuing the environmental clearance. For instance, if a dam has to be built or maybe a road has to be built, so the clearance actually has to come from the MOEF. So after conducting the processes, which the stages which we have discussed now, that is the in carrying out the environment impact assessment. So some of the main laws in India which we have are the Water Act, Indian Wildlife Protection Act, and the Air Prevention and Control Pollution and Environment Protection Act. So the responsible body for this is the Central Pollution, the Control Board, that is for the to issue the EIA or to look after these laws. Now coming to the second part of our discussion, if you look at the post independence period, that is post 1947. After independence, what we have followed so far is the Nehruvian development model, which was supporting to the development of heavy industries, and therefore there was a need of creating the basic infrastructure for development projects like big dams, mines, and big industries, and also power plants, and so on. So the Constitution of India provides the protection to the citizens from any kind of dispossessions or displacement as a consequence of these processes or programs, such as the projects and development initiatives which are being carried out. So it in some sense gives the right to private property, which has to be protected by the government. So there was a provision under various acts regarding the rehabilitation and resettlement, but there was not any national policy in this regard. So at the national level, the policy draft was actually framed way back in 1985, and the second draft came from the Ministry of the Rural Development in 1993, and also the third in 1994. So therefore, there was several bills and many R&R policies. However, all of them were perceived to be lacking in many ways. So there were various kind of judgment which were being carried out in the Supreme Court, more importantly, and guidelines regarding the displacement, where the apex court has been clear that it is the duty of the state to assure people's livelihood. So then the NRRP was which was the draft was framed in 2003 and again amended in 2006, and also finally approved in 2007, and that is the kind of how these laws and bills have to pass through, and then it takes a lot hell of time. So what is the main gist or the objectives behind the national rehabilitations and resettlement policy? So let's look at them one by one. So it is in some sense in line with what we have discussed earlier, that is the environment impact assessment, how the process is being initiated, what are the kind of stages it has to undergo before any kind of development or projects has to be initiated. So on the other hand, what we are going to look at is that if at all, or if at all any kinds of projects or development has to be initiated or to start off, then one has also take into considerations about the pre and post development projects or programs. So the NRRP is give utmost emphasis on trying to minimize displacement and to push as so much as potential, that is non-displacing or at least displacing alternatives, to provide some kind of an alternatives, and also to confirm adequate rehabilitation package, and time-saving implementation of rehabilitation with people's participation. Since they are also, the locals are also, one of the major stakeholders in any of these projects. So people's participation again is important here. Also to safeguard the rights of the weaker sections, particularly the SCs and STs. So many of these, victims are usually, the who are, the politically, weak, and then the voices are, the mostly the marginalized section. So therefore, it is important to safeguard the, this group of communities, and also to produce a higher customary of living, and also to conform to the, sustainable financial gain to affected families. So there comes the issue of, the how the rehabilitation packages are, being carried out, because in most cases committed rehabilitation packages either, lingers for a longer period of durations, or if not, they are never, being received. So therefore, one is also, it is also important to see that to integrate rehabilitation issues into the event, designing the implementation method, and to facilitate a harmonious relationship between the bodies, the accused land, and the affected families, and through mutual cooperation, that land was at what price. So the quotations normally is again being decided by the way in which how it is being measured at the, market. So these are also some of the, objectives, or the, main gist of the way in which how this NRRP is being initiated. So let's try to look at some of the content of this NRRP, so that we are pretty much familiar with the policy, and in that way we can critically look at it at a later part. So if you look at the preamble of the policy, it sort of constitutes that the provision of public facilities or infrastructure sometimes require the exercise of legal powers by the state under the principle of eminent domain for acquisitions of private property, which can lead to a mass scale of displacement. So the very thrust, that is the draft of the NRP 2006, is aimed at a meaningful addressal of these issues. So it is acknowledged both by the state and the central public sector undertakings or agencies, either have their own resettlement and rehabilitation policies, or are in the process of formulating them. So the provisions of the NRP 2006 provide the basic minimum that all projects leading to involuntary displacement must addressed. So this is a sort of guideline which is being spelled out at the very initial stage to both the state and the central bodies, or the public sector. State government and the central public sector undertakings or agencies are in some way free to put in place greater benefit levels than those prescribed in the NRP 2006. So the principles of these policies may actually apply to the rehabilitations of persons which are displaced due to any sorts of region. So chapter 2 delineates the objective of the policy, that is we have already outlined, to minimize displacement and to promote as far as possible the non-displacing alternatives. Also to ensure rehabilitation packages. So we have already outlined this a short while ago. So chapter 3 gives definition of some of the terms or the issues which are being involved. That is, who are the affected people, what are the kind of likelihood compensations, or the kind of areas, or what sorts of lands are being compensated at what price. So the affected zone includes the area or villages or locality notified by the appropriate government under para 6.1 of this policy. And agricultural lands includes lands used or capable of being used for the purpose which includes agriculture or horticulture, and also dairy farming, poultry farming, pisciculture, breeding or livestock and nursery, growing medical herbs, and raising of crops, grass or garden produce, and land used for the agriculture is for grazing of cattle, but does not necessarily include the land used for cutting of fuel wood only. So if you look further, who all constitute the displaced person? So the displaced person means any tenure holder, tenant, government lessee, or owner of other property who, on account of acquisitions of his land, including plot in the abadi or other property in the affected zone for the purpose of the project or otherwise, has been displaced from such land or other property. So this includes the displaced person. And the family means a person, his or her spouse, minor sons, unmarried daughters, minor brothers or unmarried sisters, father, mother, and other members who are residing with the person and dependent on him or her for their livelihood. So holding means the total land which is held by a person as an occupant or tenant, or as both. And occupier means members of those communities which belong to the scheduled tribe community in possessions of forests prior to 1980. Sorry. So we are in some sense being clear about what are the nitty-gritties of the content, which who all constitute what, and then who are actually being deserve to be included in that. Again, the affected family means family whose place of residence or other properties or source of livelihood are substantially affected by the process of acquisitions of land for a project or otherwise, and who has been residing continuously for a period not less than 3 years preceding the date of the declarations of the affected zone, or practicing any forms of trade, occupations, or vocations continuously for a period not less than 3 years in the affected zone and preceding the date of the declarations of the affected zone. So the resettlement zone means any areas which are located, declared under para 6.12 of this policy by the appropriate authorities. Now, if you look further at the chapter 4, it talks about or outlines the social impact assessment of the projects. So any requiring body who desires to undertake a new project or expansion of an existing project, except those which are outlined in para 7.15, which of course involve physical displacement of 400 or more families in total in plain areas, and 200 or more families in the hilly or rural areas. So the DDP blocks and areas mentioned in Schedule 5 and Schedule 6 of the Constitutions of India, which is required as per the existing laws and rules and guidelines to undertake the EIA, which we have already discussed, shall prepare a social impact assessment report in the pro forma to be prescribed simultaneously with the EIA report and submitted to the agency prescribed in respect of the environmental impact assessment by the MOEF. So as we are by now familiar with what the EIA is, let's further try to look in detail about what the social impact assessment is. It is the process of identifying and managing the social impacts of industrial projects, or maybe any kind of development projects. It can also apply to policies, plans and programs. So the social impact assessment is used to mitigate and predict negative impacts and identify opportunities to enhance benefits for the local communities and the broader society. So one of the main important principles and practice of the SIA is the involvement of the affected communities and other stakeholders in the process. So these are some of the advantages and which is unique in that sense. So the social impact assessment should form a decision making by informed decision making by government and companies from the early stages of a project when it is being initiated. So equally important is the role of the SIA in the ongoing management of social issues throughout the whole project cycle until decommissioning and closure. So as such, the social management plan that derives from an SIA is extremely important. So social impact assessment is also an essential foundation for the community agreements. So that could be at the village level or at any level. So there is a consensus or a collective decisions. So it is a community agreements and in process of the free, prior and informed consent conducted with the local communities before the start of any development projects. So this briefing explores the core of the principles of the SIA and the social impact assessment requirements of selected international instruments. It also considers some of the key challenges to implementing SIA in practice. Now, by now we are pretty much clear about what the SIA is, the EIA is, and even when we might not necessarily be involved in any kind of those projects, we can in some way be able to through our common sense to evaluate that any kind of projects, whether it's really catering to the needs of the people concerned, or to what extent there are flaws in certain kinds of these projects. So if we sort of like stretch further and try to link the SIA with the indigenous peoples, because they are always at the receiving end, and hence it is important tool to assess the social, economic and cultural impacts of the development activities, particularly on the indigenous communities. This is particularly relevant primarily for the extractive industries whose activities frequently encroach on the lands and waters, forests that indigenous peoples depend on for their traditional livelihood purposes. So, an SIA identifies the potential impacts on the indigenous title lands and then territories of the long customary use of these resources. So therefore, the SIA in some way helps to avoid the likely adverse impacts on the critical natural resources such as land, water and forest, as well as impact on the cultural resources such as sacred sites. So there is an element of the social and cultural attachment with these resources, unlike other communities who merely exploit the resources. So one can actually see the way in which how these people are being connected and which have become a way of life for them. So an SIA process also helps to identify ways that indigenous communities could actually benefit from a proposed development, for example, through infrastructure development, job creation, or support for traditional enterprise, and which could enable the residents of that communities to shape the way the development moves forward. So the process of giving or withholding free, prior and informed consent and the negotiations of community agreements requires an accurate information about the potential social impacts and benefits of a project. So therefore, one can say that an SIA is an essential foundation for other processes. So what we could actually see is that it is the onus lies on the part of those policy makers and then those who initiate those projects to give an accurate informations about the likely impacts of those projects. So that way some sort of transparency is actually being expected from these processes. Now continuing with the NRRP which we have discussed so far, if you look in chapter 6 which talk about the resettlement and rehabilitation plan. So the first and foremost is to declare the affected zones. So how many populations are to be affected and how many villages are to be displaced, and what are the kind of natural resources, water bodies, lands, forests are to be affected by these projects which are being initiated. So therefore the carrying out of survey and census of the affected persons, assessment of government land available, and also to be accrued under the Land Acquisition Act 1894 for resettlement and rehabilitation, and also preparations of the draft of RNR plan and its final publication. So every survey shall be completed expeditiously and within a period of 90 days. So families may be settled preferably in group or groups, and such sites should form a part of existing Gram Panchayats as far as possible. So this is very important point for the reason that when a displacement takes place and when groups or community of people are being displaced differently, their social and cultural bonding are to some extent being affected. So that has a lot of not simply economic but also a psychological long-term impact on those people who are being displaced. So as I had often been talking about how the social and emotional bonding of people are important in terms of their coping mechanisms in cases of disasters or maybe any kind of calamities. So every survey shall also contain in the following the village-wise information of the affected families, that is members of the family who are permanently residing, and what sort of occupations they have been practicing in those project affected areas, and also the affected families who are likely to lose or have lost their house, agricultural land or employment, or are alienated wholly or substantially from the main source of their trade occupations or vocations. And it is also important to find out whether those affected families are agricultural laborers or non-agricultural laborers. So oftentimes what happens is people who have been for generations relying on agricultural activities, so abruptly they are being displaced, and then they have nowhere to go, and then we could actually see the process of the proletarianizations where they have to really depend on wage labor and flocking to nearby towns and cities, and then so on and so forth. So they have actually become pretty much vulnerable in compared to other peoples who have been not so much dependent on those resources, or more importantly agriculture. So affected families who are or were having possessions of forest lands prior to the period 1980, and that is prior to the commencement of the Forest Act of 1980. So chapter 7 brief about the R&R benefits for the affected families. So what are the kind of likely packages which these people are going to receive. So any affected family owning house and then whose house has been acquired or lost may be allotted free of cost house site to the extent of the actual loss of area or the acquired house, but not more than 150 square meter of land in rural areas and 75 square meter in land in the urban areas. And each affected family and of the below poverty line category shall get a one-time financial assistance which is not less than what is given under any program of house construction by the government of India. So in case of allotment of wasteland or degraded land in lieu of equivalent, so each khatidar shall get a one-time financial assistance of rupees 10,000 per hectare for land development. Or in case of allotment of agricultural land, a one-time financial assistance of 5,000 per affected families for agriculture production shall be given. But the flows or the issue here is that with the rising prices and then these assistance are sometime not at par with the market value, and then even when they receive such kinds of financial assistance, many of these affected families are helpless and they can't actually do anything in terms of building houses or maybe in terms of buying lands or so on and so forth. So maybe the urging need would be to revise some of these financial assistance depending on the market value and standard of living of the people. So each affected person who is a rural artisan, small trader, or maybe a self-employed person shall get a one-time financial assistance of rupees 10,000 for construction or working set or so. So the R&R benefits for the project affected families belong to the STs and the SCs. So infrastructure facilities and basic amenities to be provided at the resettlement zone. So the plant shall also in some sense contain a program for development of an alternative fuel fodder and the NTFPs resources on the non-forest lands within 5 years sufficient to meet the requirements of tribal communities who are denied access to resources primarily from the forest. So in chapter 8 it sort of includes again the redressal and mechanism. So in all cases where this policy applies, that is the NRRP, the state government shall constitute a grievance redressal cell under the chairpersonship of the commissioner for resettlement and rehabilitation for redressal of the grievances of the affected families. So the grievance redressal cell shall also have an expert technical person. So in case of the projects involving land acquisitions on behalf of the requiring body, the cell would be funded by the requiring body. So it would be ensured that the cell functions efficiently and independently to ensure proper implementations of the R&R plant. So now on top of what we have discussed, which is the gist and the content of the policy, one can also look at some of the problems usually after the displacement. The marginalized communities such as the tribals and then other indigenous communities are actually at the receiving end, and they are more vulnerable in compared to other communities, and women actually suffer the most simply because when they are being displaced or any kind of changes in terms of their locations and or maybe depletions of resources, they are actually the ones who bear the brunt of all this. And also the economically weaker sections, that is the BPL, are in some sense the most affected by displacement. So I'm reading out a quote which is from Medha Patkar, an activist who have been spending times for years in trying to follow the kind of displacement, the dispossessions vis-a-vis development pertaining to the server dam and closely the working with the Adivasi communities, said that government is nothing but more than a puppet of industrialists and capitalists, snatching all natural resources away from the people. So on the other hand, for the multitudes, Dalits, Adivasis, agriculture workers, farmers, fish workers, artisans and forest dwellers who have been facing the harsh reality of displacement and complete dispossession for years, there doesn't seem to be even the hope of rehabilitation now, is something which we also need to take into considerations given the grassroots experience and to what extent this the NRRP policy we are being really put into practice. So it remains to be seen that whether these policies are effectively being implemented or not. So the likely negative impact or the positive impact of displacement can be further elaborated here, and then I'll conclude the lecture. So the impact of displacement again can be seen in two ways. That is, in the positive note, one can see that a few persons may experience improvement in their status by way of increasing in the size of, say, land holdings, or maybe a rise in income may occur, and a break in some oppressive social hierarchies may also result. So these are some of a very selective or unique cases, and they're sort of like a possibilities and assumptions. Whereas compared to the positive note, the adverse impact or the negative impact seems to be much more higher, and particularly in the domain of the social, culture, and economic. So what happens is that when displacement takes place, and when people are being displaced from their natural surroundings, which they have like depended on it for generations, the production system gets dismantled. So they have actually become a fish out of water, and then really struggling to even survive. So the productive assets and income sources get lost, and people also get relocated to environment where their productive skills may be less applicable, and the competition for resources greater. So people who have that traditional ecological knowledge, when being displaced, because it is those knowledge are again place based, and then it is context specific. So someone who is pretty much skillful in cutting a wood may not necessarily adapt well, and then when being displaced or have been pushed to become a industrial worker or maybe a factory worker, so he can't really utilize the skill which he have. And also along established residential groups get disorganized, and informal social network and safety nets are being broken. So that sense of communitarianism which is being built around when people are being at one locations, their displacement in some sense have a long-term effect, not just psychologically or emotionally, but also in terms of the social fabric, and then the social mechanism which they have is being broken and torn down. So that in some way have put them in a much more vulnerable situation. So we could see the kind of displacement and dispositions more importantly, and what are the likelihood impact is landlessness and change in land holding pattern, joblessness and occupational shift, homelessness, and loss of access to common property resources. And one can also look at these further. So I'll skip this part and try to because we're going to have another lectures on accumulation dispossession and the later part of our lecture series. So winding up what we have discussed so far is that from the very days of the colonial era legislation, the Land Acquisition Act of 1894 in some sense until the present day, and what we have talked about, the Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act of 2013, which is also again known as LARR Act. There is a controversies and a confusion which have clouded the process of acquisitions. So what we do now is try to give conclusion to what we have the limitations which are under the national rehabilitation and resettlement policy. So what from the studies which are being made so far have pointed out that though this policy has very good objectives and various provisions regarding rehabilitation and resettlement, it has certain limitations, and however the policy has main object to reduce the displacement, but it does not have the provision of alternative for that, and this policy does not provide the particular time frame for rehabilitations and resettlement. So when the particular R&R policies are being stretched on for a longer duration, then it causes a lot of problems. And this policy confers all the powers in the hands of the government offices, and they transfer during the course of development project. So this is also one drawbacks of this policy again. And this policy also exempts to other laws which are having already the provision for rehabilitation and resettlement. And the policy don't have the provision for establishment of a regulatory authority, though it has the provisions of monitoring authority. So you can further look at the details of what we have discussed, and refer the reference here for understanding more about the environmental impact assessment and national rehabilitation resettlement policy. Thank you.